A DUI stop. Hey, it happens all the time. We know that. What happens if you are stopped for driving under the influence? Well, it takes us to this week's case. Involves a real man, Vince Coleman, up in Minnesota. Vince was pulled over as a result of a suspicion by an officer that he was driving under the influence. Vince, was asked whether or not he would take a breath test. And Vince said, sure, I'll take a breath test, and the breath test was begun. Now, when a breath test is given, at least in Minnesota, the officer generally waits up to 15 minutes before beginning the test in order to allow the person who may have had a good amount of adult beverages to see how they're doing and whether or not they're going to be burping, whether they might be throwing up, etc. And so the officer waited a little bit of time, began the breath test, and partway through the breath test, Vince burped, and the officer stopped the test. And the reason he stopped the test was that if someone who's suspected of a DUI burps during a breath test, well, that burping creates mouth alcohol, which will make the test invalid. So the officer did what he was supposed to do, stop the test. He started another breath test, and partway through that test, Vince again burped, and the officer said, oh, this is an invalid test too. So the officer, having tried these two breath tests, said, well, how about a blood test? Will you consent to that? Vince said that he would consent to that. Blood was taken, and it was determined that Vince was driving under the influence. Now, on appeal, he was convicted at the trial court level. And on appeal and at the trial court, Vince, through his attorneys, argued, wait, this was an improperly obtained evidence and it has to be suppressed because I agreed to a breath test. And when we went forward with the breath test and suddenly the test was changed, we can't bring in the blood test. Now, interestingly enough, he did agree to the blood test, but notwithstanding that, he is saying that, wait a second, you really get one shot at this state of Minnesota, and you get to decide what test you want to do, but once you start that test, you can't change in the middle of the stream to a different kind of test. So he argued that, and at the trial court level, the trial court said, nope, you're wrong. In Minnesota, we can do it this way. Went up on appeal. A very interesting thing was stated on appeal. The court reviewed the various statutes and the regulations. They said the officer acted absolutely correctly, pursuant to regulation, and what they found was, and what they stated was, that Minnesota, once someone gives permission to a test for determining whether or not they're driving under the influence, it is up to the officer to make a determination as to what test can be given. In this instance, the officer asked him whether he wanted to have a blood test, and he agreed to that. But the court pointed out that the officer has discretion as to what test is to be given once permission is given to basically allow a test. And certainly the officer cannot simply administer one test and say, oh, gee, I don't like the results of this, and then try a different test, whether it's urine or a blood test. But the officer has that discretion in Minnesota to do that once permission is given to take a test to determine whether someone's driving under the influence. And in this instance, they said the officer acted completely reasonably. It was reasonable the way in which he conducted the test, and when he did the blood test, it came back positive, and that's the end of the story. The evidence does come in, and you are guilty, Mr. Coleman. Okay, so what do we learn from this case? What we learned from this case is a unique thing in Minnesota, and that is permission for a DUI examination, whether it's blood, alcohol, or urine, once given, can apply to all of those tests based upon the discretion of the officer. Now, this varies from state to state, and some states have regulations that state that you must specifically give permission for a blood or urine sample to be taken. In this instance, however, we find that a state, Minnesota, allowed the evidence to come in based upon the discretion of the officer. Now, what is the purpose of knowing about this? Well, if you're out there driving through the country, especially during the holiday seasons as we get into whatever time of the year where you might be imbibing in some fermented fruits, well, guess what? You may be in a state that when you give permission to take a breath test, you in fact are also giving permission for a urine or a blood sample. All right, we bring you this case, we bring you every case so you understand how the law works. I'm David Allen.